So we all know the story, right? America enters World War II because of Pearl Harbor. But what if I told you that was just the final push? The real story is actually this incredible journey, this tug of war that took the US from a country that wanted nothing to do with the world's problems to a nation right in the thick of it. And it didn't start with an explosion. It started with an idea.
A date which will live in infamy. Man, what a powerful line. Those, of course, are the famous words from FDR talking about December 7th, 1941. And that phrase, it's just burned into our history, isn't it? It perfectly captures that national sense of shock, of betrayal. But to really feel the weight of those words, you have to look past the quote and see the number behind it, the human cost. 2,403. That's how many Americans were killed that day. Think about that. In just a couple of hours. That number, that sudden, brutal loss, that's what flipped the switch for the American people. It's what took public opinion from stay out to let's go almost overnight. And it's what gave FDR's words so much power.
So yeah, a day of infamy, for sure. But it begs the question, right? How did a country so dead set on avoiding foreign wars end up right in the crosshairs? To really get it, we've got to go back a bit. We need to rewind the clock. And that brings us to Fortress America. You have to remember, after World War I, America was, well, traumatized. The last thing anyone wanted was to get tangled up in Europe's problems again. The whole mood of the country was isolationism. The idea was, let's just build a giant fortress around ourselves and let the rest of the world do its thing. And this wasn't just a popular opinion, they actually wrote it into law. They literally built legal walls. The Neutrality Acts came into play, and they were super strict. You couldn't trade with nations at war, you couldn't give them loans. The whole point was to cut off any possible path that could drag the US into another mess. The mission was simple: don't get involved no matter what. But, as things started heating up in Europe and Asia, those walls, they started to feel less like a safe fortress and a lot more like a cage.
And that's where we get to the arsenal of democracy. See, President Roosevelt was looking at what was happening with Nazi Germany, and he knew that just sitting back and watching wasn't an option. He saw the danger. So he starts this really delicate dance, slowly, carefully, shifting the country away from that hardline neutrality. And his argument was brilliant, really. He said, the best way for us to stay out of the war was to help the ones already in it, fighting for the same things we believed in.
Now, this didn't happen overnight. It was a series of very calculated steps, each one pushing the envelope a little more. It all kicked off in '39 with something called cash and carry, which was basically a clever way to bend the rules. Fast forward to 1941, and you've got the huge Lend-Lease Act, where America's just flat out supplying the Allies. And the last big move before war was declared? A shoot-on-sight order against German U-boats. I mean, at that point, the U.S. was pretty much fighting an undeclared war in the Atlantic. But that was only one side of the globe.
Because while all eyes were on Europe, things were getting really tense over in the Pacific. The United States and the Empire of Japan were on a collision course, and it was all about two things: Japan's massive imperial ambitions and its desperate, desperate need for natural resources. The key phrase here is economic self-sufficiency. See, Japan is an island nation. It just didn't have the raw materials, the oil, the iron, the rubber, that it needed to fuel its modern military and its economy. So what do? Well, for them, the answer was to go out and take it. They began this aggressive expansion into China and Southeast Asia, and that put them in direct conflict with American interests in the area.
And this kicked off a really dangerous game of tit-for-tat. Japan makes a move into French Indochina, the U.S. responds by cutting off its aviation fuel, but then came the knockout punch. America imposes a total oil embargo. Think about this. Over 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. This wasn't just a sanction, it was an existential threat. So for Japan's military leaders, the options were suddenly very simple. Either they give up their ambitions entirely, or they go take the oil they need from the Dutch East Indies. And to do that, they had to take out the one thing standing in their way: the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. At this point, any talk of diplomacy was, well, it was pretty much pointless. The two sides were just worlds apart. Japan's demand was basically, end the sanctions, let us do what we want in China. The U.S. fired back with what's known as the Whole Note, which demanded Japan get out of China completely, no strings attached. For the leaders in Tokyo, this wasn't a proposal, it was an ultimatum. It meant giving up everything they'd fought for. The writing was on the wall, war was coming.
And so, here we are, full circle. The diplomatic doors were slammed shut. The American oil embargo was strangling Japan's ability to wage war, so they made their choice.
a preemptive knockout blow. The attack itself, it was just staggering in its scale and execution. Imagine, in just an hour and a half, you have more than 350 planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers that essentially cripple the core of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. From a purely military standpoint, it was a shockingly successful operation. 8 battleships sunk or badly damaged, hundreds of planes destroyed, and of course those thousands of lives lost.
But, beyond all the physical destruction, there's one tiny detail that changed everything. Japan's official message, the one breaking off negotiations, was supposed to be delivered before the attack. But it got delayed. It actually arrived after the bombs started dropping. And that single detail, it transformed the event from a military-first strike into what every American saw as a cowardly, treacherous sneak attack. And just like that, any debate about isolationism was over. The country was united, and it was ready for war.
After that, the dominoes just fell one after another, super fast. December 8th, the very next day, the U.S. declares war on Japan. Then, 3 days later, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declare war on the United States. And Congress didn't even blink. They immediately declared war right back. In the span of just a few days, America went from being the arsenal of democracy to a full-blown combatant, fighting a massive war on 2 fronts in 2 different oceans.
Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. Was the attack on Pearl Harbor actually a massive strategic failure for Japan? Their goal was to hit America so hard that it would be forced to negotiate to stay out of their way. But it did the exact opposite. It awakened a superpower. So while Pearl Harbor was definitely the trigger, the path to war was long and complicated, laid down years before. And in the end, that date which will live in infamy didn't cripple America. It unleashed an industrial and military giant that would go on to reshape the entire world.